Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, July 2nd, and we will hear the presentation, Parks Are an Essential Business. Disclaimer, we're having weird internet troubles between my end and our presenter's end, so please bear with us. It's not our fault. It's just the internet is just being weird. So please just bear with us. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that chat box. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association. So thanks to our speakers today for joining us. We appreciate it and looking forward to it. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions for July. So be sure to head over to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, and there you can register for all of our upcoming sessions and get more information on all that. We're actually, my goodness, we're booked. I think we have 1 or 2 dates left in November, 1 or 2 in December. We're completely booked. So be sure to keep tabs on us so that you can register for all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. So for those that would like to record your credits for AICP, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And be sure to like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important timely information like date or time changes, or when we have new sessions available for you to register, I'll post it there. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We record all of our sessions and post them up on our YouTube channel. If you head over there now and subscribe, you'll get notified when I update new sessions, and you can look through our over 350 so sessions. If there's any particular topics, you can just type in a keyword and our sessions will pop up. So be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast to register for upcoming sessions. And we also have some on-demand sessions available on our website, ethics and law. So if you need to get those credits, they're viewable on demand through the end of this year and you can get credit. That is the end of my housekeeping. I am going to turn it over now to Andrew, who's going to kick us off. And I'm going to turn the controls over to you, Chris. And we're going to cross our fingers that everything works.
Thanks, Christine. I appreciate it. And welcome to everyone. We're going to talk today about parks and how they're an essential business and what we've learned really in the past year, 18 months. We gave a version of this presentation about a year ago, and it's been interesting to go back and look at the information that we presented. We've got some updates in terms of statistics and information, but also some updates on some of the projects and case studies that we talked about a year ago. So it's been really interesting to go back and update this for now July of 2021, and it's been an interesting last couple 18 months, I'm sure, for everyone, and we look forward to fielding your questions as we go through this. But again, my name is Andrew Overback, and joined today by my colleague Chris Herman, who you'll hear from here in a moment. We're going to do a couple things here today. First off, if you pop the agenda up, we're going to talk about lessons learned from 2020, and there certainly have been plenty of those. We've had a chance to update some of the statistics, and they're pretty sobering, really, just to compare where we were this time last year. Certainly the future is looking brighter here for the moment. We'll hope that continues. We'll talk a little bit about how cities have responded, both both to the pandemic and also to some of the social unrest that happened in 2020. And then we're going to spend a little time talking about Columbus and equitable access to parks and open spaces. And then we've got some really interesting work to share with you in terms of what the future looks like, both from the city level and the regional scale in terms of improvements to park and open space and equitable access to both. So really excited to share some updates with you all. There's some really great projects that have been completed in the last year that come to bear on this, but there's also a couple of really exciting announcements coming up as well that we'll share with you as we move into the month of toward the latter part of the month here of July. So lessons learned from 2020, and we really sort of put this into two areas as we thought about this. And the first one really is we started this presentation out when we first made it back in May of 2020, talking about equitable access to parks and open space. And then we had all of the protests and social unrest and all the important topics around equity in this country that sort of came to the forefront during the pandemic and because of the police violence in this country. And we really thought about things just a little bit differently as we prepared this presentation, even a month later last year. And that was really, you'll see here as we go through the example of Columbus, equitable access to open space, physical access, right? Breaking down the barriers, connecting neighborhoods, connecting parks to where people live and making sure people have physical access to open space. But there's really another aspect of this I think we really need to, as planners, think about, and that is, do people feel welcome in these spaces, right? They may have physical access. Do they feel like they can be in these spaces themselves? And we saw this happen a lot last year, not just, George Floyd, many examples. Ahmaud Arbery, he was going for a run in a neighborhood and wound up getting shot. You have in Central Park, Christian Cooper, who's a bird watcher, told someone that they need to put their dog on leash, and she called the police, right? So a place where he is engaging in a perfectly normal activity in a city park and made to feel extraordinarily unwelcome and accosted in that public space. And then we obviously have had lots of testimonials from people. This is one example from Shola Richards in Los Angeles, talking about walking around in his neighborhood and really noticing that he's treated differently if he's not walking his dog or on a walk with his daughter. And so we realize that people are not treated equally in these spaces when they are in public, and we as planners need to understand that and make sure that how we program, how we design public spaces needs to account for that. Extraordinarily important lesson from 2020. And then I think the other sort of interesting anecdote, and this was a story that Mayor Coleman here in Columbus told as the Cider Greenway project was unveiled in downtown Columbus in 2016. He tells a story of as the project was nearing completion, construction fences were still up. Tells a story that he sort of, after a morning run, snuck in past one of the construction fences, was sitting on a bench and just, taking in the beautiful park space that he was about to unveil to the city. And he was approached by a security officer that told him he couldn't be there. And he turned around and said, "Well, I'm the mayor, and I'm absolutely allowed to be here." So we know that, how people are treated in these spaces, no matter how beautiful they are, is not always equal. And then the sort of last point I want to make about this today is our public space is for public discourse. Our civic commons here in Columbus, other example in Louisville, they were the places where the community came together to protest, to have their voices heard. And many evenings, both in Louisville and in Columbus, they were not treated well by the police. And in fact, there are lawsuits pending against the Columbus Police Department around this very fact. And so another thing for us to think about is how do we make sure that these spaces where the community can come together, have their voices heard, make sure that those are easily accessed, and we have that ability in our functioning democracy. And I think one bright spot from this, and you see some of the public art here in Louisville, but in Columbus, the artists came together and created just amazing murals all throughout downtown, and these have been saved, and they are set up in certain areas of the city right now, so that we have sort of a long-standing sort of documentation of what happened last summer. We don't forget these lessons that we've learned. So we'll talk a lot more about this, and you'll see this sort of theme woven into our conversation today. But know, as we focus primarily in the second half of the presentation about physical access to parks and open space, that equitable and access to open space is just as important, so that people feel welcome in those spaces.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So one of the things we learned from the pandemic is that it had a crippling impact on our lives and our mortality and on our economy and livelihood. Andrew and I were reviewing our presentation from a year ago. It was interesting. We're up to, closing in on 200 million worldwide cases. A year ago, actually a little more than a year ago, we were at 7.5 million. So we've come a long way, 7.5 to approaching 200 million worldwide cases. Back in what was it, Andrew, May, we had 115,000 deaths in the U.S. And we are now, this number is even already out of date, over 600,000 deaths in the U.S. today. And then at the peak of COVID, we had 42.6 million unemployment claims. And even by the end of last year, looking at the data, 384 of the 389 metro areas had employment rates that were up in 2020. Again, not a surprise, but showing the breadth of the impact of this pandemic. By end of first quarter last year, we were at a 4.8% GDP decline. I think it came close to 5%, but thankfully towards the end of last year, things got a little better. So overall in 2020, we're at a 3.5% GDP decline. But it is, sobering to look back even just over this past year. But not only did it impact our physical health, it impacted our mental health, and it's really put a sharp relief into all the issues, the societal issues that we as planners know existed and worry about on a regular basis, but it really shined a spotlight and highlighted a lot of the structural inequity. So just looking at death rates, again, this is from last year, but the difference, we knew that COVID early on was impacting older people and that they were more susceptible. But what we saw as COVID continued to spread through our communities was that African-American communities, Hispanic and Asian communities were represented disproportionately in percentage of deaths per infection. This is for a number of reasons, includes historical, locational inequities that we've been talking about these past year, and that manifests itself in population and health. And I'll also say, I think many of you probably saw it, there was a recent release of the impact on overall life expectancy in the US, and it showed, and it was worldwide data, it showed a drop in 2 years average life expectancy on average. But when you look at the minority communities, it was closer to 4 years for the Black community, 4 years, I think, for the Asian and Latino community. So definitely it's impacting communities differently. And then we kind of already knew this, though, because this map is showing you something put together by the Kirwan Institute, looking at Central Ohio, particularly in Columbus, but at neighborhoods that were identified as low opportunity neighborhoods. They're shown here. This has been a focus of the city administration. But here you can see it's stunning. If you live in one of these neighborhoods, your life expectancy is 26 years lower than the highest income neighborhoods. That is staggering. So we've seen what COVID can do. It's terrifying, but we had a major issue for a long time that we've just got to be addressing. And then we all know our health is determined by a number of factors, including genetics and eating habits and lifestyle. But our physical environment plays an important role. And that includes our built environment, our natural environment, and our work and neighborhood settings. And so as planners and lovers of green space, you can see here some of these lists: the natural environment, green space, trees and grass, weather, so important. And that second point, that the sidewalks, bike lanes, and roads. While we're going to talk a lot today about park spaces and green spaces, the reality is not only are those important public spaces that we as communities and planners control, they're publicly owned, publicly controlled spaces. Our streets are also huge public spaces. They're linear greenways. We need to be thinking about them that way. So we need to be doing things like putting street trees up. We need to be making them more like a greenway, not just a transportation corridor for cars. We need to be connecting with bikes and sidewalks and making these connections between our neighbors and communities so people can get out and stroll and move and be active and go places and find those recreational environments. So there's a lot of things, but there's a number of things, particularly in the public sector, that we can control and should be making sure that we are enhancing. While people talk qualitatively about health benefits of parks, there's a growing volume of quantitative data that highlights the positive physical and mental impacts of parks on people's health. They have medically proven benefits, and this is just a sampling here, but I'm sure all of you have seen it. We continue to talk about there are proven health benefits of parks and green space. And, just a couple summary points here. If we get enough physical activity, if we get out and move around, it can prevent 1 in 10 premature deaths. That's amazing. Not getting enough physical activity is actually costing our cities, our economies, our communities money. You look at that $177 billion in annual health care costs associated with not getting enough physical activity. We all talk as planners about how we design in movement and activity as just part of our built environment. So we need to be doing this. We need to be getting people to want and look forward to getting out, moving around. And so if there was any positive benefit of COVID, I think it was people rediscovering park space and getting out into our natural environment. And these health benefits of parks span demographics and age ranges. So you look at benefits for children, you look at benefits for adults, and for aging healthy. So there's just a long laundry list of really important benefits that we get from being out and active in our park spaces. So the next thing we really want to talk about is access equitable? And we're going to be showing you a number of things, but this is from 2 parks in the city of Columbus: Elk Run Parks on the left, Joan Parks on the right. The Three Rivers neighborhood and Joan Park and Linden. So these parks are about the same size. They're both 5 acres. One has all the types of amenities that were part of a recent update, and the other is really what you see is what you get. And the city has made a priority of working hard to update and upgrade their parks, but it takes resources. We all know this. And so what has been a challenge, and which is finding and allocating enough resources to continue to update our parks across time in a kind of regular, methodical way, has become more challenging as our park budgets have been often some of the first thing cut in the past, in Great Recession and other times, and rarely made whole again after those cuts. But surely, if there's anything we take away from this past year, is how important our investment in green spaces are. And we really want people that see this presentation to take that away. We've just got to invest in our park spaces. And hopefully communities are using some of the money, of the federal relief money, to focus on and get back to expanding and improving our green spaces. But it's not just the parks themselves. It's also the access and connectivity. I mentioned the importance of our streets as public spaces, as linear parks. So on the left is a street connection to a park in Clintonville. And on the right is Hudson Street, which actually connects to Joan Park that we just had on the previous slide. And you can see the difference. I mean, just think about if you're a parent and your children want to go play in a park, which one are you going to feel more comfortable having you walk or travel to get to the park? As a parent, which one are you going to be willing to let your kids go on their own? It just highlights some of the safety issues, the concerns, and the inequity that occurs if we're not thinking about how our neighborhoods connect to these green spaces. And so obviously we all have a lot of work to do, but these need to be forefront in mind as we're investing in our community. The other thing that I think is interesting, again, Andrew's going to touch on this, but as more and more people got out and used our parks to get social distancing and get outside and experience the world still instead of just sheltering at home, we saw our trails and pathways become heavily used, and realizing, hey, we need to connect more of them. But also in certain places, and particularly in Columbus, trails like the Olympia Trail, so many different users. And again, this was already happening pre-COVID, but just accelerated with COVID. So many users that they're almost overwhelmed. They are overwhelmed in sections. And so we need to be thinking about how do we make trails that can accommodate the kind of people that we want to have using, the numbers that we want to have using, and that are using. And then in places like Central Ohio, those of you that are familiar with Columbus, we've got some great north-south greenways that follow our rivers. Again, Andrew's going to talk more about that here in a minute. But a need is east-west trails, and it's hard to get those east-west connections. And on the right there, you can see the connector, and the way we were able to create a connector between two north-south tributaries was to run it along an interstate improvement project. And while it's great and critically important to have connectors, you can see the kind of environment we've created. We've just got to, again, figure out how to continue to invest in these kind of things to make these more attractive and inviting, and, as you'll see on the next slide, safe. This is that same connector trail. And again, it's running along an interstate with high traffic numbers. And we have people that leave, unfortunately, leave the road for various reasons. But when our trails are right next to it like this, without any kind of safety or protection barriers, you can see the impact. And luckily, in this case, no one was there. But I can also tell you, having traveled State Route 315 every day for work and living, I live in Worthington, we see the same kind of impact on the trail that follows along 315, where cars leave the road and eventually stop and hit something. And we hope it's not people. Again, we've got to have trails. We put them in places that we can make it happen. That's the most important thing. But now, as we continue to improve our communities, our corridors, we also need to be thinking about how we make these safe and more pleasing, more inviting. And then we've all been talking, I know, as planners, about the safety of streets for not just vehicles, but for pedestrians and bicyclists. What we saw, this is information that was really interesting, came out about the summer of last year, done by Ohio State, that showed that while traffic numbers were down on our streets because people weren't traveling and going as much into work every day or otherwise, the speeds jumped. And so we saw high jumps in the rate of speed of people that were on the roadways. And so we had lower traffic volumes, but higher crash rates, higher injury and fatality rates, not a surprise. And it just shows that because of the impact of speeding. But again, pre-COVID, we already knew that this was a concern. Just in Columbus from 2015 to 2019, we had 74 pedestrians killed, 4 bicyclists killed in just the city of Columbus. And those were the people who were killed, does not even get into the people who are injured. So it's always been, continues to be a concern. And then another piece is thinking about our parks big enough. Obviously, we want to get as much green space as we can. We have some great large parks in Columbus and in Central Ohio. This is an example of Whetstone Park. So you can see that the cars in the top right in our parking lots were not socially distancing during COVID because they couldn't. But once people got out into the green space, there was plenty of room to do that. Another example is this is the side of Greenways in downtown Columbus. There's enough space here for people to separate families and friends to be in their own groups and still get an activity and carry on and enjoy the spaces. But we have a lot of places that probably aren't big enough. So this is a consideration we need to think about, is how do we create these large destination parks and provide the access so that people can enjoy them. And then lastly, before I turn back over to Andrew, this isn't, well, COVID seems new to all of us and to our generations here today. We've had previous pandemics, and they've had profound impacts on the physical design of our cities. And Central Park in New York is a great example. It was really designed in response to the pandemic of that time. And so we can see that this was a response in New York City to addressing how to get more people outside and separated and improve wellness and lives. And it's had many other positive benefits as well. So I think the question for all of us now is, how do we respond to the pandemic of our times, and what do we do to treat, I think, again, not just parks, but also our roadways, our access, our greenway corridors? What is our response? What should we be prioritizing moving forward? Andrew, thank you.
Great, thanks, Chris. So what we'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how cities have responded, and I think you've probably seen a lot of different responses in the cities across the country. Chris, if you go to the next slide. One of the early ways we responded here in Columbus, this is a mural that a homeowner painted on their fence along the Olympia Trail that they continually sort of add new characters to, which you see they added Dr. Fauci to the mural, which is pretty good. But we know cities were doing a lot of things to accommodate the way people started to use public space. All right, so we've all been on Zoom or GoToMeeting more. People actually working more because they're online more, but they're also getting outside. So we saw bikes almost impossible to get a hold of. Anything that was an outdoor recreation item, whether that was a kayak or a bike or a skateboard. I've got a friend that runs a skateboard and roller skating shop in Atlanta, and he sells stuff as soon as it shows up on the shelves, even this year. People adopted dogs. Saw a lot of COVID dogs walking around my neighborhood. So people were outside, trying to be as socially distant as they could. Park systems responded in numerous different ways, and we've sort of moved on from that because a lot of those restrictions have been lifted. But I think there's some long-term impacts that we wanted to talk about a little bit more here today. So, one of the things we saw last year, and before we did this presentation, sort of polled some of our park colleagues. Great Parks down in Cincinnati last year, first 6 months of the year, saw a 34% increase in park usership and an 83% increase in Hamilton County Trail users. Similar numbers here in Franklin County Metro Parks this time last year, with a 60% increase. Went back and looked at some of the statistics for this year. Those numbers have flattened out a little bit, but they're still way up from 2019. So we had crowds of people in public spaces, and we had to come up with a lot of rules and ways to sort of control those crowds, keep people separate, but enabling them to get outside, which was really critically important and continues to be today. But there's been some long-lasting effects of this, and I think this is an activist in a neighborhood in Toronto that sort of said, well, this is what a 6-foot radius around a person looks like, and you can see how wide a sidewalk has to be. Pretty simple but effective illustration of that fact. And so a lot of cities started to look at how do we reallocate space in our right of way. Go back a slide, Chris. Yeah. So Milan was one of the first because Italy was so hard hit by COVID. They really reacted very quickly, set up a list of guidelines, reallocated space. You can see there's space for bicyclists and space for walkers. And this plan immediately went into action, and they reallocated space. In the United States, we had NACTO come out with design guidelines for response and recovery. Again, you saw cities across the country trying to figure out ways to put outdoor dining into on-street parking spaces, closing down streets for open streets. A lot of cities took that route as well. And the next example, I believe, is from Oakland, and there was some criticism of these efforts. Right? You have outdoor dining. Is that outdoor dining for everyone, or is it just for certain people? Is it for certain neighborhoods and not other neighborhoods? You saw a lot of that outdoor dining that took place really was focused on some of the more trendy areas of cities, and was that program equitably allowed to happen in other parts of the city, since that was a permitted effort. So I think that was a piece we had to look at. And Oakland was one of the first adopters of putting out a program it called Slow Streets in the neighborhoods, really throughout the city, but really got criticized early on for not involving those community members and those neighborhoods in the design of what those slow streets look like. And so they've quickly pivoted, really, I think, the first few months. Go to the next slide, Chris. They sort of changed the name of the program to Essential Places. They sort of slowed things down, really met with more community members and advocates, especially from the East Oakland neighborhoods that they're really getting a lot of criticism for, and really trying to make these streets, instead of really being about recreation, also about how do people get to work, get to school, get to jobs, and involve more community members in the rollout of that. So I think there was some speed to market that I think we did. Sometimes we're accused of maybe being a little slow. Sometimes we can be a little too fast to act as well. And so I think it's just a good reminder that we need to think about who we're doing this for, who's impacted, and who benefits as we start to think about reallocating space, which I think is incredibly important. And we're going to talk about sort of that reallocation of resources, reallocation of space, as we look at a specific case study here in Columbus. So one of the first things that we wanted to talk about here is, you're all familiar probably with the Trust for Public Lands Park Score, really measuring how much of your community is within a 10-minute walk of a park. And so this is the Trust for Public Land. You can see green is good, red is bad. At the outskirts of our city, you can see that's where a lot of the red starts to show up, but it's in a lot of the inner and core neighborhoods as well. And so we did a land plan for Columbus Recreational Parks Department. We looked at existing facilities. The mayor really has signed on to what a lot of mayors have signed on to, which is a 10-minute walk shed or a 10-minute walk commitment to make sure that everyone's within a 10-minute walk of a park from their front door or their back door of their house. So that's what we wanted to look at in a little more detail and give the city a tool they could continue to use and tweak and did something a little bit more robust than what the Trust for Public Land provides. And we looked at the impact of partners and also potential facilities. So, if you look at your partners in your community, what does that walkshed look like? And then we looked at the impact of potential acquisition and added trail miles to see what would change. And that's really had a really good impact on the city making policy changes and starting to look at a parkland dedication ordinance change that would allow them to have more money to invest in parks and open space, especially in the parts of the city that we had identified as having great need. So this is the existing access today. And what we did, which is a little bit more than what Trust for Public Land does, is we actually looked at actual physical access points to parks. So where is there actually a trailhead? Where is there actually a sidewalk and an entrance into a park? And so that allows us to dial in a little bit tighter on this information and be a little bit more precise. So 35.5% of the city is outside that walkshed, the 10-minute walkshed today, and we want to get that better. And you'll see how we're going to do that here going ahead. But one of the key things I think it's good to mention here is the 1950 boundary of the city of Columbus. So before all of the annexation, you can look at, obviously here green is good, red is bad. The majority of this ground inside the 1950 boundary has good access to parks and open space. And it's when we look outside of that boundary, as the city grew, we didn't build enough park space for our community. And so we looked at that, but we also looked at a bunch of other layers of information. So social vulnerability is an index that the CDC puts together. You can see the blue areas have high vulnerability. And if you sort of hold this image in your mind here for the next couple of minutes, you'll see that these are the neighborhoods that have the lack of access to parks and open spaces. And so it's really critical that we start to focus in on that. And the city has identified low opportunity neighborhoods, sort of outlined here in pink, that they're focusing on making improvements and reallocating those resources to these neighborhoods that are suffering from these issues. And we know these have an impact on people's health and wellness. It also corresponds very much so with sidewalk gaps in our community. So as we're talking about adding park space, we want it to be accessible for people to be able to walk to those park spaces within that 10-minute walkshed. And you can see a lot of these areas that are low opportunity neighborhoods are also ones that have these sidewalk gaps. There are also places, because of those sidewalk gaps, where we have safety issues. So this is the density of accidents involving pedestrians. Again, corresponds in many areas directly to that lack of sidewalks, and again, disproportionately impacts those low opportunity neighborhoods. Same is true with bicycle safety. This is a heat map of accidents involving cyclists. Same story exists. Obviously, you see some density along High Street, which is sort of the most heavily used corridor in the city, but again, disproportionate impacts in these low opportunity neighborhoods. And again, we need to be providing safe bikeable streets in these neighborhoods, as well as filling in these sidewalk gaps. Really critical as we think about adding open space. And then another metric that the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission updates frequently is bicycle comfort. So this is roadway level of stress rating for cyclists. We've highlighted again these low opportunity neighborhoods, a lot of high stress corridors. So again, as we think about adding parks and open space, we need to address that bike safety and comfort as well. So a couple of things are going on right now that wanted to highlight that the city's working on to make some change here, make some positive change. And one of them is instituting neighborhood bikeways. Testing this out in 5 neighborhoods right now to build 35 miles of low-stress neighborhood bikeways. You see some examples of some of those routes here in a couple of neighborhoods: Southside, Hilltop, North Linden, Near East, and then a picture here next of Clintonville. What those look like: again, signed streets, low-stress streets that they utilize to connect to day-to-day destinations in the neighborhood. So these are connecting park spaces, they're connecting schools, retail clusters, library, recreation center, farmers market, all places that people should be able to ride their bike to safely. So that's one way that the City of Columbus is looking at that. The second thing that they just completed and included a link here to the Vision Zero action plan, and I believe Christine will be able to share this deck out after today for people to have access to. The City of Columbus recently adopted an action plan for its Vision Zero program, which was just getting underway this time last year. So again, it's targeting these communities of interest, or the low opportunity neighborhoods that we've been talking about. And then in the red lines are these high injury networks. And those are the streets and areas of the city that the Vision Zero action plan focuses on. So there is a plan to address these issues going ahead. And it's great to have this action plan in place and signed on to by City Council. And
Thanks,
then
Andrew.
the next thing, yeah, go ahead, Chris, and talk about the Morphe corridors.
Yeah. So those of you in Central Ohio, I think are probably familiar that Central Ohio Communities, Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, even ULI got in the act of studying the growth impacts Insight 2050, what was going to happen and how we accommodate growth in the Central Ohio region. One of the things then that was a follow-up to that was, all right, we got to accommodate growth in some sense inward, and some corridors were, I think, the places where we could accommodate a lot of new people, and to look for things like affordable workforce housing and places where we think it would make sense, and then connect that with transit. And so the City of Columbus and CODA and Morphe have partnered and studied, and they've come up with Link Us corridors. And 3 actually are moving forward to a more advanced study. Includes the Northwest Corridor, which is shown here, the West Broad Street Corridor, and either the East Broad, but most likely the East Main Street Corridor within the City of Columbus and other adjacent municipalities. This is really about how do we create high capacity transit and make the service faster, more reliable, even dedicated bus lanes or transit lanes, improve the low stress network to get to those locations for pedestrians and people on bikes, connecting to our existing neighborhoods, and attracting new investment in appropriate locations to take advantage of these transit and help connect people with services and jobs and housing. So it's an exciting and big effort in Central Ohio. This is, again, the Link Us. So the first study was completed, mobility study for the Northwest Corridor. That summary report is out now. It's on the website. You can look at that if you're interested. But it talks about a detailed analysis of the Northwest Corridor and what can be served and what the potential positive impacts and routing are for that corridor. And now it's moving on actually to the design phase. But obviously, when you're talking about this, and those of you from other cities, a number of other cities, Cleveland, Healthline, have done things like this, but how do we integrate transit into our street network, into our built environment, and as we're talking about here today, into our low stress park and green space design. So you can see here, that is one of the considerations is how do we add and improve these corridors, not just for the transit, but also for people on bikes, jogging, strollers, riding, dog walking, those kinds of things. How do we create these pathway systems and integrate them into our corridors and connect our corridors with our park system? And then the other piece, as I mentioned, is trying to understand and see underutilized sites and how we could encourage as a community to see infill development and potentially redevelopment that takes advantage of these transit corridors. So this is showing, for those of you familiar, a site, which is a coal site near Riverside Hospital and kind of hospital curve on State Route 315. Ohio State is just to the right or south, and that's the Olentangy River there in blue. So it talks about, hey, can we see underutilized sites reinvested and have more mixed-use walkable development that takes advantage of living and housing and job opportunities and services? At the same time, I do want to draw your eye to the Olentangy corridor. And again, Andrew's going to talk more about this, but at the same time, how do we, as we've been talking about, improve these corridor linkages, the multi-use paths, amenities, improving habitat, and creating some locations, nodes of entertainment, restaurant, wellness, service, bike, canoe liveries, those kinds of things, again, to invite people out to use these corridors to connect with the open spaces, connect with nature, and become better environmental stewards. So this is really showing how, a vision of how we'd like to put all these efforts that are ongoing together, things like Rapid 5, which Andrew's going to touch on, the Link Us effort there. You can see how this is Olentangy River Road in red, the transit stop, and infill development to meet the balanced needs of affordable housing and equity that our communities are struggling with.
Great, thanks, Chris. So we'll wrap up here this afternoon with a look at the future and what could come next as we look at the CRPD land plan, and then also to the Rapid 5 project that will be unveiled here in the third week of July. So I sit on the Central Ohio Greenways board, and we've long been looking at trail connectivity and how do we build on our existing multi-use path network. And so that existing multi-use path network you see in purple, and as we look at the regional scale in the orange, we've got 500 trail miles planned. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Rapid 5 project. It's a regional, multi-jurisdictional, public-private effort to help make that trail mile goal a reality. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. But first I wanted to illustrate just back on that local level how the land plan can start to drive improvements in equitable access to parks and open space. So today we have 64.5% of our residents within a 10-minute walk shed. And in the next map, you'll see what happens if we acquire the ground and build the trails that need to be built to impact that. So we go from 64.5% to almost 80% when we acquire the properties necessary and build the trail linkages necessary in the city of Columbus. So it's adding over 2,000 acres of park space and building 96 miles of trail. But that's the goal. That's the goal to get that number closer to 80%. I think it's going to take longer than 2023, but we sort of put a 5-year goal on it. And as I said, one of the first items of business is updating the park loan dedication ordinance to build a more robust funding stream to pay for that. But as you zoom into particular neighborhoods, and we broke this down into different chunks of the city, This is the central planning area. You can just see how that impacts when you zoom in on the local level and these neighborhood level, what the impact of adding those trail linkages and adding those park spaces to the network. So in this particular planning area, the central planning area, we go from 70% to 86%. And again, it's a chance to really improve that equitable access to open space and also the trail network that people can use to get to all manner of things from school to jobs. So really hopeful that we can make that happen. On the regional scale, though, as I've mentioned, the city and MORPC and ULI Columbus pulled together all the jurisdictions along the 5 major river and stream corridors in Central Ohio, focusing first on Franklin County with the Rapid 5 project. And you can see here, truly a public-private partnership. All the municipalities along those watersheds signed on to this to sponsor it. They assigned each corridor to an individual design team. MKSK got assigned the Olentangy River. 4 other design firms were assigned the other 4, and they did a number of public outreach efforts to bring the community together around this vision of an integrated greenway and waterway system that creates a regional park network for the entire county. And I think if we're successful, what we'll do is sort of change the mental map of the city from thinking about it in terms of roadways or highways that define your mental map of the city to be the waterways that define your mental map of the city. So, you know, the goal is to build on our great Blueway and riparian corridors, adding parks and green space, adding trail connections, and just as importantly, those on-street bike facilities that need to link our neighborhoods together with our multi-use path system. And a really strong focus on doing this because Franklin County continues to grow. And as we continue to grow, we need more parks and open space. And we saw that as we documented those needs with the Parks and Recreation Department's land plan that showed where we have gaps in our system. So this is a way to focus in on that and make sure that people have that equitable access to parks and open space in the greenway corridors. And again, we're focusing on all of the things that we've mentioned here today, you know, the lessons learned that sort of became a little more crystallized in 2020, health and wellness, mobility, environmental stewardship, economic vitality, social equity, and then really looking at where are those communities of impact and who is impacted, Chris, go to the next slide, by this work. You know, schools and students, making it easier to get around the community, making it easier to attract and retain employees, but also make it easier to get to work, connecting residents and neighborhoods, connecting cultural institutions, and ensuring that these communities that are very close to some of these trails have access. So our system today, basically shown here with the green, are the sort of parks and greenways system along our Blueway corridors, and the regional trail system shown in orange. You know, there's a lot of things that are connected, but if we build the system out, go to the next slide, Chris, you'll see just how many schools are within a quarter mile of a park or trail. You know, go to 320, 660,000 jobs, over 1 million residents, 590 activity centers, and we'd improve the access to 77% of our low opportunity neighborhoods. So this is not just, you know, parks and recreation. This is health and wellness. This is economic vitality for the city of Columbus, and really an exciting vision that will get unveiled here in a couple weeks to show how these changes could really impact Franklin County. And so when we look at the whole of Franklin County, these planned improvements would put a park or a greenway within 1.5 miles of every resident. So really exciting project. You can find out more. I'll put maybe we can put a website here in the chat. I think it's called the rapidproject.org, if I recall correctly, but you'll get a copy of the slide deck. There will be an unveiling at the Columbus Metropolitan Club on the 21st of July that ULI, Columbus, and MORPC are hosting. There'll be more information available on the website as well. And you don't have to attend in person. I think you can also attend virtually. But it's going to be a really exciting moment to sort of share this vision and get that underway to make make these improvements happen, to increase access, to increase equitable access to parks, open space, and trails in Columbus. So we hope today we sort of painted that picture of what the issues are, how to document that, and then some strategies to go about how to fix it in the lens of what really has become the forefront of our planning profession here in the last year to 18 months.
Thanks, Andrew. I think just in conclusion is we just want to say that hopefully what you've got from here, I mean, all of us as planners have been wrestling with these issues. These aren't new things that just were kind of ahas to us. We've all been dedicated to make these kind of improvements. But if anything, this last year has just emphasized and given us an opportunity, I think, as planners to make the point, emphasize the point of how critical our green spaces are, our parks are to the overall wellness, to the fundamental needs of communities, neighborhoods, and cities, and that we need to take a broad look at parks and what we think of as parks, and that includes both the green spaces, but also, as we continue to show here, the connectivity, the roadways, the trails that connect these spaces are also equally critical. And so using what we've learned over this past year and the increasing amount of data to make the case to our communities and to funders that these are so important and need to be priorities for our community. So we really do believe that parks are an essential business, back to the lingo that we were using this past year, but they're really essential to all of our communities. And we look forward to addressing your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Everyone in the chat box, I did just copy and paste. Andrew sent over a link to the RAPID project. So it's the rapidproject.org, and it's in your chat box there. Feel free to type those questions in. I'm going to take okay, we're going to do something really scary here. Let's show our webcams and see how the internet likes us or not, and we can start a conversation. I'm going to take the controls back just so we can maybe see everyone. I don't know.
Sounds good.
Okay, so far so good. All right. So I'm sorry, I can't do two things at once. I'm trying to change my presenter screen. Okay, there we go. Now it's just us. So I have to tell you all, as these questions are kind of coming in, I feel like it was the beginning of, I don't know, it must have been April of 2020. Everything had just really started shutting down. And full disclosure, I think I was at that point like 2 months pregnant, so I was a little emotional. My family and I, we went on a drive just to get out of the house. We went through, I live in Northeast Ohio. We went into the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. We drove along the towpath. There's a local county park we had gone through. And there were people everywhere, dogs, whole families. I'm sure people that hadn't been to those parks ever before, people who hadn't been there in 10 or 15 years. They were bringing their elderly family members out, their children, their pets. And I started to cry. And my husband turned and he looked at me and he goes, "Chris, what's wrong? Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, I'm fine. I'm just so happy that everyone is out here utilizing these parks." And I said, I hope that it carries on and that people they become stewards to our open spaces, and they realize the importance of it when, it comes time to put more money into our community with parks and open spaces. And the tears just kept rolling. But I kind of, although I'm not crying now, I still have the same feelings that it's almost like I wonder if this was a little bit of a blessing, because people really got to reconnect and see the importance of our public spaces. Off my soapbox. We have some questions to get to.
All right.
The first one here. Okay. So the question is, does the presence of trails impact home sales? And I would like to add a little bit to this too, for both of you to address. I sit on a local architectural review board, and we review plan developments, and there's a lot of, I don't want a trail in the back of my backyard. I don't know what kind of people are going to be walking on there, and then they can get into my backyard and look in my windows. And so I guess I would say, one, what do trails do to home values? and sales? And two, how do we get around the fact that some people don't want trails near them?
Yeah,
those are great questions.
I don't have any sort of statistics at my fingertips, but I do know that generally speaking, those trails do raise property values, as does proximity to high quality park space. And I just have to say, one of my greatest frustrations, and why I'm glad that ULI Columbus has sort of stepped up to fund and organize this Rapid 5 project, is we have a 16-mile north-south greenway from essentially downtown Columbus all the way to Worthington and 270, and hopefully eventually up to High Banks Metro Park. It's a beautiful greenway, but boy, it goes mostly through residential neighborhoods, and there's not one place aside from Milestone 229, which is a high-end restaurant in downtown, and the Hills Market, which is 16 miles away along the Olympia Trail, where you can stop, get off your bike, get a bite to eat, and do something different, sort of make something out of it. And every time I go and ride, and kudos to sort of, Springfield, Dayton, Cincinnati, the Little Miami Scenic Trail, every time I ride it, I'm just like, man, how can we get this? And it goes through neighborhoods just like it does here in Columbus. And yet every time I ride the Little Miami Trail, there's new restaurants, new bars, park spaces that have opened up, things to do along the trail network that I think draw people to it and make them more usable, user-friendly, more interesting, get people out on them. And they clearly somehow, I'm blanking on, I think it might be called the Trailhead Tavern or something like that I just rode by, that is in the middle of a residential neighborhood. You look at a Google Earth, it just opened. You look at Google Earth, and it's a sort of scrap of space that they turned into a restaurant, and there's houses all around it. And somehow everybody's all right with it. And I don't know if it takes time, and there's a track record. The Little Miami Trail has been there for a while, and you've got people in that neighborhood that use it. And I'm telling you, it was popular. It was full of people. They're playing music, and I'm sure they might have some discussions with neighbors, but it seems to be a hit from everything that I could tell. So, I think the showing people what's possible, I think would go a long way. I don't know, Chris, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I would add, I think the direct answer to do trails, greenways, add value to homes, the answer is a resounding yes. I think there probably are levels. I think the more connected a trail or greenway is, the more value it adds, the more people that are on it, probably up to a saturation point, the more valuable it is, the more it is a natural corridor that has, trees and green space, the more valuable it is. So I think default baseline, yes, it adds value. I think as the corridors, the trails themselves become better, more connected, and naturalized, that it adds even more value. And I can give you an example from my childhood to now. I think I mentioned I grew up in Worthington. The Olympia Trail was built behind many homes in Worthington, connecting all the way down to Ohio State eventually, as 315 was rebuilt down through Antrim Lake. And there was lots of neighbors that complained and didn't want it and protested. But luckily, a number of people said, no, we really want this, and it happened. But now homes sell for more that back up to the trail and the river, and people advertise in real estate listings that they're on the trail or close to the trail or close walk to the trail. It is absolutely a selling point.
And the only thing I will say is I don't think I've seen anyone riding on the bike path around here with a flat screen TV sort of over their shoulder on their bike. Yeah. So the crime argument to me just doesn't ever fly.
Yeah.
Next question. What is the most effective way to keep small motorized vehicles off of non-motorized trails? So these are the motorized vehicles that are normally not allowed on trails, like motorcycles, golf carts. Now there's, even like electric scooters or electric motorbikes. Yeah. There's all kinds of crazy things now. What's the best way to do it? What do we do? Bollards? What?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some physical barriers put up, but something that's small is going to get past a bollard. I honestly think, and what we did here in Columbus, and I know it's the case down in Hamilton County in sections as well, they're patrolled regularly by our Metro Park rangers, and the same thing down in Cincinnati with Great Parks. So I think that's key. More people using the trails, reporting some of that stuff. The more eyes you have on it, the better. I'm sure it's a challenge in some other more outlying areas. And then I do think there are some design considerations. It recently happened here in Columbus a couple of years ago, right where the Olympia Trail crosses the street on Dublin Road, just adjacent to 315 entrance ramps, that a trucker, semi driver, got off the highway, realized they'd made a wrong turn, and because the trail is so wide, they mistook it for an entrance ramp back onto 315. So they drove down the bike path with their semi trailer for quite a ways before they finally reached an overpass they couldn't, or an underpass they couldn't get underneath, and they got stuck and had to be extricated. So some of it's also in the physical design of these spaces. It's a little bit wide there because I think there are some utilities that need to be accessed on a regular basis. So the trail is a little bit wider, but you wouldn't really have to squint your eyes too hard to not maybe blame that trucker for the mistake that he made, because the design is not so great.
Yeah, I do think, there's always the educational component that is probably worth on a periodic but regular basis, kind of sharing the rules of the road for trails and expectations in communities. I also think things like signage, wayfinding, or even graphics on the pavement itself that show a walker and a biker and kind of say, this area is designated, walkers stay to this side, bikes to this side, just reinforces the fact that this is for people that are walking and riding. It's not necessarily for motorized vehicles. So there's overt and subtle ways to get that message across, but it does take education, and then ultimately, if it's a real problem, not only community kind of policing, but also actual enforcement.
Thank you. Let's talk about money. How are we funding current projects? How are we planning to fund future capital improvements? Where's the money coming from?
Yeah,
that's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think our larger park systems at the city level, at the Metro Park level, at the county level, are at the MPO level, are thinking much more over the last 20 years about this and how to create networks that connect together. Obviously, they're much more effective. And then figuring out kind of how we pool resources to make them happen. I think a lot of times in communities, particularly they're thinking about this in advance and planning for it as development happens, as long as you have kind of a network plan, a trail plan, a thoroughfare plan of some kind that says usually expectations for our trail system, that when new development happens, that they create those, or redevelopment happens, that they create their pieces. And then across time, there are going to be gaps. And then at some point, jurisdictions need to say, all right, we're going to have an ongoing program of adding segments, identifying missing areas, and at some point there's enough that's been built that you say, all right, we're going to connect these pieces together. But I do think, just like we do with roadways and highways, that there's times when we need to say a certain segment is so important and we're going to put large scale resources towards making it happen.
And I think, a couple things are, larger metro park organizations obviously are levy supported. So they've got some independent funding streams. A challenge with, parks and recreation departments, usually part of the larger city budget, as Chris mentioned, I think earlier, those are the first to go. Those are the first to get cut when there's a downturn or there's a budgetary situation. And so one of the things we've been working closely with Columbus Recreational Parks Department on is looking at the parkland dedication ordinance. They have one in place already, but sort of a recognition that it's been 20 plus years since that was written. And I think there's a sense that they're probably leaving some money on the table. When new development takes place, it needs to start to pay for its share of adding parks and open space. So I think looking at parkland dedication ordinances, those are another way to sort of stabilize some of those year-to-year budget occurrences so that you've got a source of income. So that's something that the city of Columbus is looking at currently. Don't have any updates on that besides the fact that they're looking at it. That's a critical piece going ahead. And I think, as far as the Columbus story goes, a lot of our downtown parks have been funded through different mechanisms. Just like getting a residential project built, you have all this complex capital stack. They've used just about every different source of money you could think of. So North Bank Park was funded by a tax increment financing district in the Arena District. That helped pay for that park. Sidle Greenway was funded through state, federal, local grants, as well as city and county dollars, as well as philanthropic and private donations. That's what it took to get that done. And I think seeing that model be successful, and the reason I really wanted to show the funders that are behind the Rapid 5 project is it is that group of public and private funders, and a recognition that cities can't go it alone, that the MPO can't go it alone, that government grant dollars are only going to take you so far, that we need to have the philanthropic and private development community, private business community involved in these efforts as well if we're going to make the change, because we're way behind. I think really what I want to show in that 1950 boundary to the current boundary of the city of Columbus is we spent the last 50 plus 70 plus years not investing the right amount of money, and now we've got a problem, and it's going to take a lot of people involved to fix that.
I do think too that there's some kind of the branding and the visioning and getting people excited about a direction. As Andrew mentioned, all the stuff that's happening and great stuff that's happening in kind of southwestern Ohio and the Cincinnati metro area through Loveland all the way up to Yellow Springs. That was early and continued to. People saw a big vision of connecting it, and then we had the Ohio to Erie Trail effort, and people see and appreciate all the way to the state level about how do we continue to make those linkages and achieve that. The towpath trail efforts in the Cleveland area, and then when people in a community or a region see, I think, the results of some of these things, and they start asking for more. And here in Central Ohio now we have the Rapid 5, but I think hopefully most of you are seeing this in your communities as Andrew and I go around doing comprehensive plans in communities. Multi-use trails paths are some of the highest responses. When we ask a community what they want, those are almost always at the top of the list, and it's somewhere in the top 3, top 5. So it's clearly at the forefront. I think this past year is going to only bring it, even emphasize it even more. But we are seeing it. It's been a growing thing, and I think as people are experiencing it in their community areas and around the country, they're seeing the potential, and they're saying this is a critical element we want to see as part of our communities. And then as planners, I think it's critically important that we look at our communities and say, all right, what are the best places? Let's make some priority connections. If we had resources, where would you focus first? How do you have some early wins? How do you create a larger system? But have things in place and have a discussion about it, so when development does happen, when opportunities for funding do arise, we have a response and say that we thought about this and this is the direction we'd like to go. Now, I guess one last thought. We've got, the complete streets effort, we have got to make sure every time we're spending money on rebuilding a street or extending a new street, we have got to be including the complete street pieces, the sidewalks, the multi-use paths, the street trees, the green space. Those are essential components of a street, and we all need to recognize that.
Thank you. Next question. Let's talk about programming. It's critical to particularly parks to engage the community in programming. How do we go about that? How do we ensure it? How do we keep it now that we're starting especially to open back up again and we can have, local concerts and all kinds of festivals and things like that? What do we do to ensure that we continue programming, and particularly even in those parks in our underserved areas, the forgotten parks, the public spaces that we wouldn't naturally think of to have programming?
Yeah, I think it's a critical question. It's something we've been working with a number of communities on recently, ensuring a couple things. I think when we think of programming, sometimes we just think of the big events, the Red, White, and Boom or the Jazz and Ribs Fest, or, and those things are important. They're really important. They bring the whole city together, and we're blessed that we've created a sort of central gathering place in Columbus for things like that, and those events are important. But we're working with a lot of other communities right now, and I think the big takeaway is lowering the barrier to entry. Oftentimes, and having many more small events that can take place. That allows more locals to be involved, whether it's local artists, local organizers, ensures that you have a diversity in type of event. I think there's a lot of red tape that we need to untangle and make it easier for people to use these park spaces for events that they'd like to have in their community. And that's one thing we're working down in Chattanooga right now. They hired a programming person specifically to sort of curate those small scale events. So there's something happening all the time. It's not just a big weekend event that happens a couple of times a year. It's a lot of little stuff that's creating activity all year round and involving many more members of the community than would ordinarily be involved. So it's involving more voices, and it's diversifying the programming. I think lowering that barrier to entry is really important to making sure these parks are well used and that they're welcoming to all people.
And hopefully, if you got anything out of this presentation, it's that these parks are a public good. And as a public good, again, that low cost entry, they should be free or close to free, so that it's easy for any community member to use those spaces for friends to get together, for families to get together, things like the park pavilions, the grills, those kinds of things to help facilitate gatherings, impromptu, small social settings, I think are really important. And making people aware that they're welcome to do that, that we want them to do that. That's part of what these spaces are for. They're your spaces. Again, I think our critical message is to get out there and to show people so they feel comfortable and that they come and use those spaces that way.
I think one of the things that's important is to poll your users. We're doing work with great parks right now down in Cincinnati, Hamilton County park system, and ask people what kind of programming would they like to see. And that varies from one part of the county to the other, but there's certainly some themes that evolve. But making sure that programming is relevant, evaluate your programs. Do people want to, pet a turtle, or would they rather learn how to, kayak or paddleboard or, have a rock climbing wall? You need to make sure you're constantly refreshing those programs. It's important to continue to look at those with a fresh eye every year.
I would like to pet a turtle and climb a rock wall, I think.
Right. You can do both.
I would like to do all. Okay, next question. What type of sustainability goals should we be looking towards as we continually upgrade and install trails and parks? And I mean, when I'm referring to sustainability goals, and this particular question is asking about flood control, stormwater management, because we all know, especially in trails and parks and residential areas, stormwater management is at the very top. So things like that, urban heat island effect, even all the way down to the type of tree species, making sure that they're not species that are prone to having issues that will wipe everyone else out. What should we be looking at?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things are going on right now that we didn't mention today that I think are important. One, City of Columbus just did a tree canopy study. So they're looking at that heat island effect, what parts of the city have adequate tree cover, which don't, and how do we target that and set a goal to improve. So some parts of the city, I think, have 40.
And stormwater. I mean, trees do all these things.
Yeah, for all those things. Yeah. So some places had 40%, and some places were under 20%. I think the goal is to get I believe, if I remember correctly, everything being equal, the whole city to more of a 40% tree canopy. So that's an initial goal. So that's important. When we started looking at our Olympia Corridor for the Rapid 5 project, we looked at some great data that the Nature Conservancy has put together, which is marking in your community what the resilient corridors are. And so where do we have a chance to build in resiliency into our community so that we mitigate the stormwater issues and we deal with the fact that there's going to be more extreme weather events. There's going to be, hotter temperature days. And when you look at that map, and I encourage everyone to go to that, I'll see if I can quickly find a link here and put it in. For Columbus, it was those river and stream corridors where we had the greatest opportunity to impact resiliency. And so we really have to think about, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from our colleagues at Biohabitats, which is give the river room. Give the river room to grow. We can protect those edges of the river by protecting that riparian ground by having parks and open space. And so when weather events come through, they're not damaging property. There's park space that's able to sort of handle the brunt of some of those bigger events. And it's having a positive impact on water quality and all the other concerns that we have environmentally. So I encourage everyone to look at that for their individual communities and see where those resilient corridors are. And it also showed us where we had gaps, what parts of the Olentangy River were highly resilient and which parts weren't, and where do we need to make some improvements. So there's a lot of great data out there to help inform decision making.
And just to build, everything Andrew says right on. Just to add, I think we all know from a stormwater point of view that looking at a larger area, a regional or watershed area, rather than just on a site-by-site basis is much more effective and positive. And so as planners of communities, we need to be looking at a watershed or a region saying, all right, what are the best ways that we can improve both stormwater runoff and take care of that, address that, and also water quality, and then integrating those into our greenways and having trail access and habitat improvements. And I also do want to say, I think the more we learn about habitat protection, which is also part of resiliency and sustainability, it's critically important that we connect our green spaces with green spaces. In other words, by creating little islands of parks, we're isolating habitat and we're actually making it more vulnerable. The more we can create linear park connections between large areas, they're almost greenway habitat corridors, and the larger we can make those, the more resilient our habitats will be and our green spaces will be. And again, that's why part of Rapid 5 is really focusing on the river corridors as these kind of linear greenways. But we need to make sure we have enough space that they really do serve that purpose. And so, it's always about controlling the ground. But as planners and communities, we need to be worried and making sure we have buffers and setbacks and easements to make sure we're protecting the edges of our waterways and getting as much really as we can. And in areas where we don't control it, across time, trying to see if we can buy it back on behalf of the public.
And Christine, I put the link to the Nature Conservancy's mapping tool in the chat.
Oh, I see. Okay, I will copy that over. Okay, let's see. I think we have time for one more question. So let's talk about a little bit about the pandemic again. We've seen the numbers. We've seen that folks are really looking at parks and public space in a different light. Moving forward, what do you think will be the major changes, if any, in terms of the physical planning and design and management after COVID? Will there be any difference?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, what we learned was, I think, spaces available sort of in the public realm, how precious that is. And so I hope that there's some long-lasting reallocation of that space back to more pedestrian space in our sort of urban streets and corridors. I think as it relates to park systems themselves and how they reacted to COVID and the methods that they took, I think generally things have come back to normal, but it was sort of a continuum, and we sort of cut this stuff out of our presentation. But the very first, during the sort of peak of the shutdown, in Columbus, rims were removed from basketball hoops, yellow tape put up around, lots of signage around playgrounds. I think we didn't know a lot about this pandemic at the beginning. And so I think as we learned, some of those high touch activities, really weren't the drivers of spread of disease. My son plays basketball. They started doing leagues again. If you're playing, you don't have to wear one, but this spring it was very much you need to wear a mask when you're in the gym and you're not playing. And so I think we learned a lot of lessons. We've reopened, I think, everything. Most I think programs have reopened. You have to register. They're trying to control the numbers, those sorts of things. In great parks, they noticed that people were coming in large number and using the picnic facilities and gathering in groups that were maybe a little bit too big. So what they did is and gathering too close together. So what did they do? They handed out picnic blankets, to people, so they would sort of be encouraged to sort of disperse and go sit on the grass and not sort of all be gathering in shelters. So there are a lot of different things that I think people are incredibly flexible about. But I do think there will be some lasting, impact in this, whether that's touch-free surfaces, bigger spaces to allow people to be in a park and not be on top of each other. I think some really quick work that I know that the national park up in Northeast Ohio, the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, put in one-way trails on some of those high visited trails so that people didn't have to walk past each other. ODNR did the same thing with some of the more popular hiking trails down in the Hocking Hills. So I think, one-way trails, again, might be something that we have to go back to, because I don't think, unfortunately, this is the last time this will happen in our lifetime, and we need to be prepared to react accordingly and make sure that these spaces are still usable, because I think we definitely learned this year that these open spaces are critical to the health of our cities.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is I think we've learned how critically important, or relearned, how critically important our public and quasi-public spaces are, and that we do need to be caring for them. We do need to make sure we have them. We need to think about them strategically and comprehensively, and that includes things like our roads and those earlier pictures and the restaurants and the outdoor seating, and that we need more flexibility in our spaces to accommodate these kinds of things. So I think that's a big learn, and hopefully all of you listening to this, hopefully gave you some more resources, because I think it's up to our profession to continue to remind people the lessons we learned here and the data that we've gathered to help emphasize how important continued investment in parks and green spaces are.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. We actually didn't get to many questions, so I'm going to send this post report to both of you, and folks, feel free to reach out if you have any other questions for Chris or Andrew. Thanks to both of you for joining us today. I appreciate it. It was just a great presentation. And thanks to all of you for listening in. Don't forget, we are recording this. We'll post it on our YouTube channel, and a PDF of the slide deck will be available on our webcast webpage here shortly. Don't forget to copy down the 2 links that I just put in the chat box. And everyone have a safe, long weekend, and we'll talk next time. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you all.
Bye.